Hey, it's Michael. Welcome back to the show. Before we get started, I have a question for you. Does American politics ever leave you feeling just exhausted? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the entire other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, to teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, how to listen and give space, so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans: our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. There's been a term thrown around in politics here in the United States that really resonates with me, which is saying something because not much in American politics resonates with me these days. But that's actually the reason I connect with it. Now, I don't remember where I first heard it, but it certainly describes how I feel, and because you're a listener of this podcast, I'm kind of assuming it's going to hit home for you too. The exhausted majority. Have you heard this phrase? It's used to describe the overwhelming amount of people who are largely silent when it comes to politics and who exist somewhere in that in-between space, where their voices are largely drowned out by the loud, extreme, conflict-happy rantings of a vocal few. The polarized nature of politics, the zero-sum nature of seemingly every issue, the ways our leaders act and create policy not just because they stand for something, but because they want to oppose the other side, it's all just exhausting. Those in the exhausted majority, of course, might be more right-leaning or left-leaning, or they might even be like me, a registered independent. Here in Colorado, where I live, nearly 50% of registered voters are unaffiliated, and that number astounds me. But here's the thing about the exhausted majority. Our exhaustion can quickly turn to apathy if we don't realize the power of our collective voice. My guest this week is Manu Meel, CEO of BridgeUSA, a youth-led nonprofit that creates spaces on high school campuses and college campuses for open discussion between students about political issues. Manu and some friends started what would eventually become BridgeUSA when he was a student at UC Berkeley, and the movement has grown to span the country on more than 50 college campuses. As you'll hear, Manu's journey as the son of Indian immigrants could have easily taken a turn towards political apathy, but he made the conscious decision to go a different direction. That's because Manu believes that humans like talking to each other in constructive spaces. And if that's true, then he wants the exhausted majority to know that we're never out of the fight. I saw on the BridgeUSA page, your About Us section, that you actually quote the Navy SEAL ethos, never out of the fight. And I wanted to start by just asking you, why does that resonate? Why did you use that? What about never out of the fight is so important to you that you would put that as on your About page on your website?
Well, Michael, that is the first time I've ever been asked that. So thank you for going through the website and actually picking that specifically out. You know, many people don't know "Never Out of the Fight" is the Navy SEAL ethos, but it to me speaks and resonates to a story of persistence and a story of overcoming significant odds to build something that you never imagined could be possible. It really speaks to me for the story of BridgeUSA. When we started in 2017, which was my freshman year, we were like this ragtag group of young people that really didn't know each other. I was a pre-med student. I had no interest in politics. My friends were all over the place. And if you had asked then, would we be leading an organization that's now the largest and fastest growing movement in the country of young people trying to bridge our differences, I would have said you're crazy. And what got us here was one thing, and that was just grit. It was grinding and it was working hard. And importantly, it was a commitment to a mission. It was about finding purpose. And that's really why I do this work. So I deeply appreciate that question.
Hey, I wouldn't be a journalist. I wouldn't call myself an independent journalist if I didn't do the work like that. So
I appreciate that.
I'm glad it resonated. It's just so interesting that to sort of understand the background of Bridge USA and how you came to be. Now you're the CEO of that organization. Just the fight that took place, the kind of battle that took place to get to where you're at, and that's where I'd love to go with this. Is take me back to the beginning of this and how even the idea of Bridge USA came about. And yeah, we're going to certainly tackle some of the obstacles there, but what precipitated starting an organization that, at my from my vantage point, it's about crossing lines of division. It's about communicating well, like we talked about before we hit record here. What got you into this line of work, Manu?
Bridge's story, Michael, is a story of authenticity, of passion, and of people being in unlikely situations doing something that they suddenly found they cared about. We had no, and we being myself and my friends that have built Bridge, as I'd alluded to in the never out of the fight question, had again no interest or idea about politics. I was born in the United States in 98. My parents had immigrated here from India. I moved around all the time. I lived in a village in India east of New Delhi for the first 5 years of my life. People like me don't think about politics or democracy. In 2017, my freshman year, second semester, we were students at UC Berkeley, and the speaker by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos showed up to campus. Now, Milo, for some in the audience, might not be someone that they know because he kind of dropped off the map, but he was a conservative provocateur, to say the least. And he showed up, and I remember I was walking past this cafe, Michael, and next to this, I was back from my math seminar, and there were these protests happening in the distance. And Berkeley, we have a great relationship with protests. We protest big things, small things, everything we can get our hands on. And so I chalked it up to another protest. Remember, cafe, windows broken in. Inside, there was a TV screen and said CNN, breaking news, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. And the crazy thing about that was the television crew that was filming that segment was standing right behind me. And that was the breaking of the fourth wall in democracy. Suddenly, I became a participant. And the next day, me and some random people got together and said, hey, campus community is hurting. Those protests turned out to be the largest protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s. And that was it. We said, there's resentment, there's anger, there's pain. Let's just create a space for people to communicate. Turns out humans like to talk to each other in environments that are constructive. And we kept holding that space. And that space spoke to this desire that people have, this feeling of alienation, uncertainty, this feeling that we're all walking on glass all the time, especially when it comes to politics. And that's how we got started. It was in earnest, and it was an authentic moment of being thrust into something that we were never called on. But we became incredibly passionate about that. And that's the story of Bridge.
Manu, going back to something that you kind of threw in there, you said people like you don't get interested in politics, and I'm curious why. Why did you say that?
Because we don't have the time. It's not, to me, it's not, you know, I think one of the biggest threats that American democracy faces is apathy. And I was one of those people that was very apathetic. And sometimes still today, I fight apathy on a daily basis. I got up today in the morning and I didn't want to work. I didn't want to participate. I didn't want to think about what's going on in the world. And oftentimes, folks that have a lot on their plate, they've got a lot going on. Whether you're successful, there's no need to care about politics. And if you're not successful or you're not or if you feel like there's a lack of purpose or you're struggling to put food on your table, you don't have the time. And so people like me, stories of immigrants, especially in this country, is a story of just trying to get by so that we could make our parents' sacrifice count. That was at least the case for me. Politics is extracurricular. Just ask my parents that.
I love that. Okay, so you see the protests, you kind of break the fourth wall, like you said. I'm interested in the switch that flips where you go from not that your decision was not I'm going to get involved in the protests, but your decision, Manu, was I'm going to get involved in figuring out a different way. And you even use the phrase humans like to talk to each other in constructive spaces. How was that the path that you chose to go down? Why not just get involved?
We chose the way of BridgeUSA because for me, my experience and my story has been one of always trying to care for people in times of trouble. That's it. You know, when I lived in India for the first 5 years of my life, and I became accustomed to village life, and I saw what my grandparents were doing, and my parents were living in the U.S., and then I came back to the U.S. and I moved around every 2 years until I got to college, from New Jersey to Staten Island to Boston to Berkeley. My life story was always one of adapting. It was always one of trying to suppress my ego to let other people fit in, to work to figure out how I could fit in. And that ethos does not mend itself to passionate protest. At best, it allows you to be empathetic, and at worst, you sit on the sidelines. And that day, I chose to do something, and I chose to lead with empathy, and I chose to lead with empathy with people that also wanted to lead with empathy. And again, to me, I don't think we're building anything different. What's odd, Michael, about this moment, especially as a young person, I'm 23 years old, we're talking about creating a society where people are comfortable coexisting with each other, creating common ground to find common solutions, and working through their differences. I mean, this is just like marriage, family. It's just basic stuff to me. And so that's what's so tragic about this moment. But that's what drove me to get so involved in this work and lead with empathy, is because my life story is one that always catered to that as opposed to passionate division.
And I'm interested in the life story. You've kind of you talked about setting your ego aside to help others and to bring about reconciliation. I'll use that word. What were those experiences, Manu? I mean, can you point me to one or two that really stand out to you as a driver for that setting aside of ego?
You know why I love that question is because I think that a lot of people can see themselves in that question. If you're listening to this, or Michael, I'm sure you've had experience of this. Imagine yourself at one point in your life where you showed up into a room and you just felt like you didn't belong. Whether it was because of your race or your merit, or the fact that you were just, someone's secretary and you were just supposed to sit in the back, whatever the case might be. You showed up in a room and you didn't feel like you belonged. You felt uncomfortable. That was basically my life for like the first 17 years of it. It was one, because I was moving around all the time. I didn't have the chance to create permanent friends. Two is when I made the transition back from India, my parents finally brought me here permanently. I was this like 5-year-old village matted hair boy, and like people know what I'm talking about. If you've been to like India or Africa or some of the other countries that have like villages with mud huts, like you can smell someone that is from the village as opposed to someone that lives in the city. And I had to figure out how to navigate that. And one of the most important lessons I learned through that journey, Michael, was that sometimes you got to be willing to sacrifice your sense of self-importance to let other people feel like they belong in your experience. And dealing with difference and dealing with anxiety towards difference was, to me, not really something that I tried to develop as a skill set. It was a survival method. It was a way for me to make friends. It was a way for me to belong, and it was a way for me to help create a difference. And so that was what created the propensity for me to think about this.
So this is a coincidence or just wonderful timing in that answer. And you mentioned empathy earlier. I just posted on social media today, and I want to read you the question that I posed. I didn't answer it, but I want to read you, and I want to hear your answer to this, Manu. I posted, is it possible to be fully empathetic to someone else's pain, frustration, or anger without having first suffered similarly? What do you think?
I think that question begs. It's such a good question. It's actually a version of a question that we get asked a lot. In the political context, the version of that question is, how do you speak to someone that exists in a different power dynamic than you? How do you speak to, or where do you draw the line between what's allowed and what's not allowed? Or are there certain experiences that you shouldn't have to empathize with? When I think about that question, it makes me beg the prerequisite, which is, what does empathy mean to me? And for me, empathy is two things. I think one is, empathy requires, again, a suppression of your sense of self importance for a moment to create space for the other to exist. Whoever the other might be, your friend, it might be your family member, it might be someone that you're trying to have a conversation with, it might be an elected official. And secondarily, I think empathy requires not just sympathy, but a deep sense of listening, a listening out of curiosity. Monica Guzman, who you've had earlier on the show, talks about the fact that we have two ears and one mouth. And we lead with our mouth and we follow with our ears. And that puts the cart before the horse. And so, if you take that definition, that empathy requires you creating space for whoever it is that you're talking to, and you deeply listening, I think that is possible in any context. I think where people go a little wry with this question is when they think that, take my example. One of my best friends lost his father 3 years ago. I've never lost a close family member. He lost him to brain cancer. When his father passed away, I deeply listened to his pain, and I focused on not bringing me up, but focusing on him, putting the light on him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if I empathized or made him feel like I understand the pain, because I don't think empathy is necessarily understanding, but I think empathy is making the other person feel like they belong in that space with you.
Gosh, that's good, Manu. Okay, so you brought up something that I hear a lot as well, which is this almost guarded wall of, and especially happens in politics, I don't want to give space to them, to those people, to the people across the aisle, to the people I disagree with, to the people who vote differently than me. I don't think they deserve the platform. And I know you've written about that in some of your work as well, giving platform to ideas or ideologies, I should say, that perhaps don't really deserve a platform. How do you respond to that line of thinking if we go down that route?
I rationalize that by asking the opposite of that question, which is, what happens if we don't? Let me tell you a quick story, Michael. In 2019, after we'd created the first couple of BridgeUSA chapters, we held a discussion on immigration. This was at our Arizona State chapter, and I remember the discussion was about border immigration at that time. And Trump had won 2 years ago, and so there was a huge conversation about illegal immigration. And I remember in that discussion, we had DACA students there. We had students that were very pro President Trump. And there was a specific moment in that when the student stands up and puts on his Trump hat, while a young woman who was a DACA recipient — for those of you that don't know, DACA is the special status given to former illegal immigrants that now have permanent status in the country. And she was sharing a deep story about her life and her struggle, and he gets up and he puts on his Trump hat in an act of theater, I think. And we immediately, went to the heart of your question, which is, oh no, he's about to get a platform, everybody pull out your phones, here's the Twitter moment, here's where someone takes down someone and it's terrible. What happened was that the young woman shared her personal story about fear and anxiety about coming to the States and trying to make something of an experience that she never had. And then this young man talks about his fear of his family that used to live in the El Paso region in Texas, and the fear that they have with illegal folks coming through and potentially ruining their crops and hurting their farm animals and striking fear in the heart of their neighbors. And suddenly, that took away from the policy and the Twitter and the platforming and all the nonsense that we talk about and all the buzzwords, and it went to the human. It was a story of two people coming together in a shared understanding of fear. Now, that fear might not be equal. I'm not here to litigate that. What I am here to litigate is that if you follow through in that process, it leads to something profound. Not always, but if you create the space for it, it's more likely than ever. Just returning to that first question that I asked, which is, what happens if we don't? At scale, we're living at a moment, a political arms race, where there is less and less and less incentive to hear out people that are different than you. And a democracy depends on the ability for people not necessarily to come together, but to coexist. And so if you don't, then I think the outcome is far worse.
The story of that that DACA student versus the Trump student, the space that you gave for those two to exist and eventually uncover that shared definition of fear. You mentioned earlier, and I wrote it down, humans like to talk to each other in constructive spaces. Was there any doubt that that would be the case when you started thinking about how do we put this together, and at Bridge Berkeley, when you're first starting to generate the seeds of this movement and this idea and this organization? Was there any fear for you, Manu, that that wouldn't be true, that coming together in those shared spaces would not be constructive?
Of course, there's doubt. I have doubt every day. I still have doubt.
Yeah.
I spend 90% of my time thinking about why this work won't succeed because I think it is so easy to talk yourself into a bubble of an ideological bubble of bridgers, ironically, that all think that this work is going to all turn out well and that humans are great. The sad thing that we forget about basic human nature, and again, this is why this stuff isn't that complex to me. It's how humans have operated for thousands of years. There's a very kind side to humanity. There's a very love and nurture side to humanity. There's also a very violent side to humanity. There's a side of anger and resentment and fear. The challenge that BridgeUSA faces, and challenge that people way smarter and way more advanced than me face, is how do you create spaces and atmospheres and environments to help the better angels of our nature win out, as our partner organization Braver Angels often talks about? Because
Mhm,
there are
mhm.
also dark angels. And there's a couple of things that we do to try to ensure that that works. The first is that we have our 4 norms of discussion. What we found is that when you outline norms of discussion in a conversation, you create mutual terms of understanding. And when you enforce those norms through social behavior, it becomes much harder to break away from the crowd. Our 4 norms are: you have to listen rather than to respond. Everyone represents themselves and not groups. Uh, don't interrupt or have side conversations, and lead with empathy. The second thing that we do is we train student moderators, and these students are leading student discussions. We want students to be talking to students, and student moderators are trained in trying to facilitate that conversation, to enforce those norms and to structure them. And there are more instances than not where this stuff doesn't work, but we learned so much from that experience. And interestingly, when we fail, the failure is not in that the people that came to the discussion now hate each other even more. The failure is in that those people at least still see the possibility of what can happen. And that's what's powerful, is we got to plant seeds. We got to plant seeds. We got to say, this is what happens when you succeed in this process. The last thing I'll say, because I know I'm running a little over, is that whenever people talk about conversations and dialogue, when you talk to someone on the street, right, and you're like, hey, do you think we should have conversation with people that are different than us? Yes. Do you want to do that? No. It sounds like a life sucking experience. Like, when are you? Even I don't aspire to, on a daily basis, to be in an ideological brawl with people. So
Yeah.
a big part of my job, beyond just structuring those conversations and operationalizing a chapter network that facilitates this at scale, is creating the social conditions for these conversations to be life-giving experiences, which is a whole nother conversation.
Let's go there. That that to me is, I guess, the great sticking point of the work that all these organizations do. You mentioned Braver Angels, the work that Bridge USA is doing, Common Ground USA. I mean, just so many people that I've had on this show who are just independent actors in this. Even myself, the struggle is, how do we take these conversations? How do we take the constructive spaces that we've created and built, and the guidance that we've laid out there, just like those 4 norms of conversation that you just listed, and make them so that we employ them and practice them in everyday life?
Yep.
How do we do that?
That's the question.
Have you
That's the
figured it out
question.
yet?
I actually think we're close.
Yeah.
I never I try to be very humble about where we are as an organization, but I think part of the reason why a bunch of 23-year-olds have stuck around in this space and have skated by every year despite the risk of financial extinction is because I think we're close. And here's why. And I can't speak to the broader American public, but I spend, again, as I said, 90% of my time thinking about why this work won't succeed. And specifically, we're doing this on colleges and high schools. Young people, anybody that's listening that has kids knows that that's one of the toughest audiences to win over,
Yeah.
especially college students.
Yeah.
You're showing up with like tremendous moral ambition. Either you're trying to get a job or you're trying to change the world. It's one or the other. And to win in that environment, and specifically, let me layer one other thing on top of that. I think too often in this work, this is the case with anything. When you're trying to build something, you oftentimes don't understand who the consumer is. And so we took a lot of time to understand, what is someone my age thinking? How are they approaching the world? I'm 23. Here's a quick snapshot of someone's my age's lived experience in this country. We were born around 9/11. We went to middle school around the Great Recession. We graduated high school in the year that was 2016, and we graduated college in the year that was 2020, which is the pandemic, the Capitol riots, the Black Lives Matter protests. Not a great sample size of democracy. So now you're meeting someone that is 20, 21, 22, or 18 or 19, and they've got this lived experience. Most of them either don't care and are just not interested because they don't think anything is solvable, or they're highly pessimistic and highly engaged. Now, if you hit someone that is demanding a certain sense of action with, let's just sit down and talk to each other and listen, that sounds at best like hokey pokey, and at worst like ceding the ground to people that are destroying your livelihood. So we have to, I think, articulate bridge building, conversations, dialogues as a way for people to exercise their moral ambitions. That this is not only a method and a methodology to be a better person in your daily life, but it is the backbone of every major successful social movement in the 20th century. From the Gandhi salt marches in 45 to the civil rights movements in the 60s to Mandela in 90, this is how you create the world that you want to live in, whether you're conservative or a liberal. So I think if we start talking about this work in the context of helping people and meeting them where they are, I think that's different and that's more profound. I think we're all talking about the what, as Simon Sinek says, and we're not talking about the why. And I think we're going to talk about the why.
Yeah, for sure. What were the inklings in those early days as you were just getting this organization started there on the Berkeley campus, that told you there's an appetite for it?
There are two things that were pretty profound to me. The first was that first ever discussion that we held, which, by the way, I think I would be living in a totally different world if it hadn't gone well. Because, like, again, I wasn't someone that was like, I'm gonna have discussions every day. That first discussion, man. We had like 70 to 80 kids show up, which for me at that time was crazy. I was like, wow, people actually showed up for flyers that we disseminated. That's awesome. And and everybody showed up to that room incredibly guarded, incredibly skeptical of what was about to happen, and incredibly pessimistic about just that moment. And they were sad. Basically, everybody was sad in some way or another. And over the course of that discussion, I mean, you could see one by one, like students lighting up, like people literally, like their eyes opening, like this Antifa student was talking about why they were violently protesting that event, but then the conservative student talked about why they felt like we absolutely need free speech in this country, and it was an amazing moment. So that was one instance in time, and interspersed throughout the last 3 years. I mean, you talk to anybody out there, anybody, talk to your neighbor for Christ. The amount of people that will tell you that we live in one of the most divided times, that they're sick and tired of it, that they just want the world in which their family does better than they had aspired for. Everybody wants something similar. We just talk about it in different ways. We have different life experiences feeding into it. And so if you want to get really technical, the market is telling you one thing, then to me, the onus is on us to figure out how to meet people where they are. I think that's the charismatic challenge that the bridge building field faces, because the market is there. We just commissioned a study, Michael, or not us, but we work with an organization called Starts With Us that commissioned a study with YouGov. We found 87% of Americans uh, want the world in which they can empathize and listen to each other, and they're pissed off with what's happening. You that's probably listening, I will bet my negative net worth, so don't take it how you will, that there's a 9 out of 10 chance that you that are listening right now, that you're like, yes, this is what we need, this is what we need. The question that you're going to ask, which is what you asked, Michael, is, well, how do we make it happen? And we can talk about that more in an operational way if you'd like, but there's a lot of hope there.
And that's, yeah, you lead me right into the question there, Manu. BridgeUSA now is a network, right, on college campuses across the country of these similar constructs, if I'm understanding it correctly. How do you operationalize this? How do you begin to not just have conversations about it, but affect change.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start with a very basic premise and then articulate how we create the change that we're trying to build. The very basic premise is that we do not have a democracy if we can't talk to each other. That's it. To me, it's that simple. And the secondary subset to that is that humanity's core competency, what has allowed us to evolve, and I mean this in this Darwinian sense, was our ability to communicate. The first Homo sapiens, their ability to come together in tribes and have literal dialogues was what allowed us to get from groups of 8 to 8 billion. That was it. Everything else is dressing. The foundation of the cake is our ability to talk from a very evolutionary perspective. So, given that premise, how do we elevate the bridge mindset? What we know people want. The bridge mindset being open mindedness, curiosity, empathy. You plug your word in, basically a synonym of how do we get people to talk to each other? Three things, and this is the case across social movements in time. Again, from the movements that I referenced to even some of the most insidious movements in history. First, you got to develop the individuals. You got to train them. You have to find your champions. You have to find folks, the 5%, the people that are going to go to fight, go to war with the concept that bridging is the way that we build a better society. That means our chapter networks. That means scaling that up. We went from 3 chapters to 20 to 50 to 70, and now our goal is to get to 250. The second thing is you got to create the social conditions for what they're talking about to be popular. Right now, everybody's incentivized to divide. If you want to win office, you divide. You want to get the most likes on social media, you say the craziest shit. It's that simple. So we got to create the social conditions and social permission for people to be loud about this. And third thing is simple. You help people be friends in this movement. This work gets lonely. You got to create community. You got to create common purpose. You have to ensure that people find an identity. And so when you have people that associate their identity with bridging, they're trained and equipped with these skills and find other people in this common fight. And now they have the air cover, the social narratives behind them. It's game over. That's it.
You said you spend 90% of your time figuring or thinking about why it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask, what are the headwinds? What are the things that you're fighting against? And just to give you some perspective from my vantage point, you talked about our ability to talk, our ability to physically talk to each other, just like what you and I are doing right now. We have that. But I am of the belief and of the position that we are not taught to communicate well, to use that ability to talk, to actually bring that to conversation and communicate well. You've mentioned several elements of that. Listening to listen rather than listening to respond, bringing empathy into the conversation. I believe asking questions is a huge part of that, as is the name of the show. So going back to the question, and I'll ask it and shut up here. What are the headwinds that you're fighting that cause the 90% of your time to be spent on why is this going to fail?
I want to reverse that question back at you because I also like to ask questions, which is and you've been an independent journalist and you know this world better than I do. What do you think are the headwinds?
Yeah, the big thing that I think comes back to our the fact that we were not taught to communicate well really stems to the what we were taught. So I'll outline what we were taught. We were taught to find the right answer and argue that answer to the death, to speak with such certainty. That's what got you the good grades. That's what gets you the promotion. That's what gets you the airtime if you're running for political office, to use something that's relevant to our conversation and the work that you do. It's what gets you the most likes and retweets and shares on social media, being certain of a position, often a negative position. There's studies that show that the negative is what spreads or goes viral more than the positive. So we're playing on fears and being certain, taking a courtroom mentality into conversation where it should be more of a give and take, back and forth. Let's understand each other. Let me ask you questions because I'm curious about who you are and what your experience has been, rather than your what your belief is. Like, you are not your belief, you are the sum of your experiences. And so that, to me, if I were to say one thing, it is our drive for certainty that is crushing us right now.
Yeah, I mean, well,
thoughts?
we just saved time on the podcast because it's half my answer. Um, See what you can do, folks, by asking questions.
I love
Uh,
it.
you know, we're embodying the bridge mindset, Michael.
Absolutely.
Um, it, I think that's right. I'll just add a couple things to it.
Yeah,
Um,
please do.
uh, and I think that's actually a very root causal answer because a lot of things stem from that. Because of our drive for certainty, you have uh, an environment on social media that was initially built in a very neutral manner that now primarily involves the spreading of the craziest, most provocative headlines or the things that we find most angering. With elected officials, the drive to know and understand and say that I know for certain that this is how the world should look like and this is the policy that'll get us there is what's leading us to create bigger and bigger and bigger claims. Frankly, the reason why we came up with the phrase the largest and fastest growing student movement in the country is not because we like to brag, but that's because it's what sells. It's so certain, man. And then nobody also questions you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, no one is like, well, that might be wrong. Um, uh, so I'll say this. I think that beyond sort of our drive for certainty, there's this huge problem of apathy that I think is also plaguing our society. Democracy is only as good as what we put into it. The fuel of democracy is people. Um, a- and right now, that pump is running really dry. Whether you take my generation or you take older generations, yes, voting turnout has been incredibly high, but I think that turnout is on the backs of a lot of fear and uncertainty. And when you have engagement on
Right.
fear and uncertainty, and then in general you have apathy, then at best people are just staying home. And I think this gets to a deeper question, which is how do you articulate hope? I think right now, and now I'll take this specifically to the political and the democratic space that we work in. You're basically asking people to invest in a house that everybody says is shitty. Like if I was a student and you're like, by the way, you got to invest and buy this bond, you got to invest and buy this bond, oh, and don't, just so you know, it's a junk bond, but you got to do it. Everybody right now is selling a story and a narrative of the country that paints a pretty dismal picture. And so this is where I spend the other 10% of my energy is how do you craft a narrative at this moment in America that is historically accurate, that is largely inclusive, and that gives people a sense of purpose in the country. And I'm happy to get into that narrative and what we're coming up with, but I think that's the other piece is we've got to solve this apathy problem, and I think it starts with articulating the fact that tomorrow will not only be better, but it will only be better if you get involved. And that there's a lot of potential for it to be better. So we got to shift the narrative.
There's so much nuance in that, Manu, and it reminds me of something that I wrote down that you wrote that I want to read and then ask you the next question here. You say, if young people adopt the zero sum nature of today's discourse, then the future of our democracy is at risk. And what you just described there, and if I can be a little bit more pointed about it, it feels like it is recognizing the flaws that we do have, but not labeling that as the doom and gloom that I think it often feels like, but also accepting the fact that improving upon it does not look like a total victory. That all of a sudden we're going to make these one or two decisions or vote these one or two people into office, and the United States will be the shining beacon on a hill, or
Yeah.
maybe that's the wrong the wrong analogy to use, but like all the problems will be fixed. And so it's that binary you talked about, that zero sum binary, that either all of our problems are horrible and we're horrible as a country, or these are the one or two few key issues that if we just make these decisions, all the issues will be solved. And what you just described in generating that hope is there's nuance in that. Am I correct in I guess presenting it back to you that way?
You've said the N word, nuance. And what I mean by that is like the nuance these days is so hard to come by because we live in a world on 30-second clips. In eighth grade, I remember I came back from middle school. It was eighth grade. Just come back. I was 14 years old, and I remember complaining to my mom because we never celebrated Christmas, and we were like, it's not that we were poor or anything. It's just that's just not something we did. And all my friends celebrated Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever their holiday was at that time of year. And I remember just being so annoyed. I was like, every time I was like, our family sucks. It's like I legitimately was like, what are we doing? And I was like, this is terrible. And my mom was like, you know what? Why don't you go live with the friend's family that you want to live with that does celebrate Christmas for a week? And I was like, okay, deal. I show up to their house. I thought this was the perfect family, Michael. I walk in, we have a great time. I'm vegetarian, but that week I got to try some meat. It was like wow, like this is crazy. And then 3 days in, I started to see some of the problems in that family. Some of the challenges that their parents had, and I remember some of the challenges that their siblings had. And I came back from that week with a sense of perspective that, yeah, my family's got some issues, but so does everybody else's. And that's America in a nutshell. This is the only land, only country, only family we know. And it is the human condition to always focus on the negative. And yes, I understand. A lot of us have lived experiences grounded in negative history, grounded in systemic problems. But that's the only life we know. And so, because we lack that perspective oftentimes, it means that we think that everybody else has got it better. And I think what we have to start doing at this moment is let's think about the story of America. As you said in the binaries, America is either the worst country in the world or it's the best country in the world. How about we throw out another word? It's the most ambitious country in the world.
Mm.
Ambition means that you try, you work hard, you strive for something that's great, and you fall short. And then you get back up because you're never out of the fight. Ambition means that you aim for the highest points of humanity. By 2045, Michael, the United States is going to be the most diverse country in the history of humanity, in the history of societies. By 2050, we're going to have gone through technological change like people have never seen before. By 2075, the global order is going to be something that is tremendously different. That is an amazing opportunity to build something that people have never seen before. And that's a stock that I want to buy. So, yes, you have to point out the problems to be historically accurate and to create space for people that feel marginalized and oppressed. And at the same time, you have to also create a patriotic energy and fervor that's built around principles of the founding, principles of ambition. And that's how we move forward, is recognizing that, yes, our family's got issues, but everybody else's does too. That's it.
That reminds me of a time when I was in high school, and I had a core friend group of it was me and 7 others, so there were 8 of us, and we all chose. We drew out of a hat, and we all chose to go stay the night at someone else's house. So we would come home from school to a different house. We would eat a different dinner, served at a different dinner table. We would sleep in a different bed, wake up in the morning to a different routine, and just yeah, I had a similar experience to you where it was like, oh my gosh, I appreciate home.
Yeah.
But I also understand now my friend just that much more because I lived in their space for a night. And
It added nuance to your reality.
100%, 100%. So I'm curious, Manu, your experience. You mentioned moving to all those places as a young kid. The experience of building this up and bringing so many different views into those constructive spaces. You mentioned hope there, and I gotta ask the question: what gives you hope right now?
I was first, let me say this. Um, People that claim to be hopeful all the time are lying. People that say that I'm just optimistic all the time is
Yeah.
just not true. That is one certainty that I am certain of, because I've met people that have claimed to be the most optimistic, and then you see them in their darkest moments. The important thing about that question is I don't think we're striving to just be hopeful all the time. I wake up, as I said earlier in the podcast, I wake up some days and it sucks. I am down. In 2021, I had a very public period of anxiety and a fear about both the country and my own personal life, and I wanted to be public about it because I feel like hope you get hope when you realize when you're not hopeful. You got to show those experiences. That said, right now I am actually some of the most energized I've ever been, mentally at least. Physically, I'm really tired. Mentally, I've been incredibly energized. Here's why. In July of this year, I work with Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's estate. And it's and on the board there we were having a conversation about reckoning the history of the United States with especially respect to slavery and where we are today. And the fact is, in 2026, the United States is going to go through its 250th birthday. And we were talking about that. And for a second, I was like, wow, that is a long time. And then I was like, I'm curious. I Googled a little bit and I wanted to contextualize America's birthday in the context of broader empires and nation states and societies. And the Chinese Empire, I found out, lasted for 1800 years. The Roman Empire lasted for 1100 years. Uh, Athenian democracy lasted for 300 years. And I realized that we're not, at the end of the American story. We're just at the beginning. We're in maybe chapter 1 or 2, depends on how long the books are that you read. This is just the start. And so I think when you have perspective and a well of knowledge and a recognition that what we're dealing with is not only expected and normal in the span of human history, but is also something that is an incredible flashpoint in human history, then all you've got is to look up. So that's how I find hope, is finding perspective in our time. Um, I've got one other story I want to share with you, but I don't know if we have time.
No, please do. We
One of
absolutely have time. Yeah.
So I'm kind of a crazy person sometimes, and one of my favorite things to do is get on road trips, and it goes back to talking to people in the country and just understanding like what are Americans thinking. What does it mean to be an American? Surprise! It means something different to everybody. So my most recent road trip was from uh, 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 Austin to Boston. Austin was in the middle of the country. Boston is where my family lives, and I drove from Austin, Texas, to Lake Charles, Louisiana, to New Orleans, to Meridian, Mississippi, Selma, Alabama, to South Carolina, then to Fayetteville, North Carolina, then up through DC, and then to Boston. And almost at every stop on that trip, whether it was at bed and breakfasts or bars or in museums or in community farms or oil rigs, black pastors in Georgia, conservative activists in Alabama, uh, you had carpenters, I remember, in Louisiana, and everybody said something around three things. And I said this earlier. One is that I aspire in a world in which my kids do better than myself. Two is something about education and wanting to feel safe in their society. And three was feeling like they were cared about. That's it. That's the human experience.
Yeah.
It's not that complex. And so again, to your point, and what you do so well with your questions is if you break it down to simple units of human nature, of human understanding, of time, and we get out of our screens a little bit and we take a step back, it is incredibly fulfilling and very life-giving.
In all those conversations you've had, is there something that you've pulled out where you could say, if I could get everyone to just start doing this more, what would that be?
If I could get everybody to take a second after listening to this and write down on a piece of paper 3 people that aren't their family that live near them. It could be their neighbor. If you don't know their name, then this exercise is even more important. It could be your local gas station. It could be your doorman, whoever it is. 3 people. And over the rest of this day, take about 60 seconds of time with each of those people and just say hello and ask them, what do you care about in your life? It'll not only be an incredibly fulfilling experience, and yes, it's sometimes awkward, definitely is awkward. But I just be the magnet for awkwardness in that conversation will work out. But you'll realize, as I find so often, that people are people at the end of the day, man, and our job is to help people see that reality. The only other thing I'll just say is, of course, you're gonna have tough conversations. Like all those people that I met on that road trip, like of course there were some people that were angry. There were some people that were very racist. There were some people that were just confused. Some people were like, "Why is this random brown kid coming in talking to me?" So it's not all roses and sunshine. But the fact is that it again fills your well of hope, so that we can build the story of America. Because we're only in chapter 1 or maybe 2. That's it.
And we want to tell the story of an ambitious nation that is never out of the fight, right?
Absolutely, sir. Couldn't have said it better.
Well, hey, Manu, last question that I ask of all of my guests. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
So there's two questions that immediately come to mind. One is a stupid question,
I want
and
to hear. I
and
want to hear both. I want to hear the stupid one.
so the stupid question is, uh, I want people to ask me what my GPA was in college. And the reason for that is because half my time speaking is spent speaking with young people and talking to people my age and people younger than me, and and uh, uh, there's this image that people have when people are doing public things that they must be incredibly smart and incredibly put together, and man, I am not that. So that's the stupid question that I always have my peers and those younger than me ask me. Uh, the second question that I deeply care about is, what has kept me going thus far? And the answer is not actually the mission of our work. The answer is not this hopeful, optimistic narrative that I've been telling. Uh, the answer is that I made my best friends out of this work, and some of them still live with me, and that we worked hard and we made relationships and we learned a lot from each other, and it was an incredibly enriching experience. And the reason why I say that is because whatever it is that you're working on in that moment is important, but there are basic principles that apply to anything it is that you're doing, whether it is you're looking for that promotion, you're trying to build a better culture at work, you're trying to be a great journalist. That's my story, is that I would not be here without my friends. And then I find the moral courage and ambition and excitement and passion to get out there and get into the fight.
All right. So you answered the second one. The question has to be asked of the first one. What was your GPA in college?
Let's just say I ended my high school senior year GPA was, I think, a 2.7.
Okay.
And then in college, it ended at like a 3.45, which to many people is not bad. But the amount of times people think I have a 4.0 is just. I also almost did not graduate college. I barely made it out. I was on the wait list coming in, so they barely let me in, and then they barely let me out.
Well, I can I guess the right word would be empathize there. I ended college at a 3.4, but that was after I found journalism. I started in civil engineering, and I almost got kicked out when I got a 1.9
Uh-huh.
GPA one semester, and they almost told me to hit the road. So
Man.
finding what you love, finding people you love to do that work
Oh.
with, as you said in your second answer, makes all the difference. I found journalism, you founded and found BridgeUSA. So Manu, thank you so much. This has been great. I've taken so many notes. How can people connect with you, see the work that you're doing? Where can they go?
If you're a young person, bridgeusa.org, get out there. Let's get active. Let's build this together. If you're just interested in following our work, I'm on Twitter, Manu Meel 1. I'm on Instagram. Uh, BridgeUSA's got its socials, so please check us out. And again, remember that what we talked about is important, but my work does not succeed until you take action. So I need you to take action. If not for myself, do it for your weird doorman. As I talked about. And the only other thing I'd say is, Michael, you asked some amazing questions, and I just want to say this on the record, that very insightful, very thoughtful, and it really makes you think. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. You just made my day. I appreciate it, Manu. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been fantastic, and best wishes to you, okay?
Take care.
That's it for this episode of The Follow-Up Question. We're one away from 100 episodes of this show. So many thanks to you, the listener, you listening right now, for joining me and all the guests on this journey. That includes today's guest, Manu Meel. So many thanks to Manu for sharing his story on the show. Please do me and Manu a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help us spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations here on the show with the amazing guests like Manu Meel, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.